Restaurant denies man in Harris shirt, then he buys the entire franchise. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The smell of sizzling oil, charred meat, and simmering sauces filled the air as orders were barked out over the hum of kitchen chaos. Plates clattered against countertops, and the rhythmic hiss of the grill punctuated the din. It was mid-afternoon, and every table in the restaurant was occupied. The waitstaff moved quickly, dodging each other like a well-choreographed dance while the chefs grumbled over a ticket that had come back wrong. At the front of the restaurant, however, a different kind of tension simmered. A man had just entered through the heavy glass doors, pausing briefly to let the noise and energy of the restaurant wash over him. He was wearing a navy blue shirt, the name Harris printed boldly across the back under an American flag. The shirt looked new, crisp, the kind someone might wear with pride. It seemed unremarkable, but the way he carried himself, calm and steady with a quiet confidence, made people glance at him a second time. "Table for one?" the man asked, his voice polite but firm as he approached the host's stand. The hostess glanced up from her station and gave him a perfunctory once-over. She didn't respond immediately, her smile faltering for just a second before she caught herself. "Let me check," she muttered, flipping through her reservation book. Behind her, the restaurant manager stepped out of the kitchen. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with thinning blonde hair and a permanent scowl etched into his face. His name tag read Rick, and he had the demeanor of someone who believed his authority was never to be questioned. Rick's eyes landed on the man in the Harris shirt, and something flickered in his expression, a mix of recognition and disdain. He didn't even wait for the hostess to finish checking. Instead, he strode forward and planted himself in front of the man. "Sir, we can't serve you here," Rick said abruptly, his tone clipped and condescending. The man blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me? You need to leave," Rick repeated, crossing his arms over his chest. "We don't have space for you." The man glanced over the manager's shoulder at the half-empty tables scattered throughout the dining area. "It doesn't look full to me," he said calmly, though his voice carried an edge. Rick's scowl deepened. "I don't care what it looks like," he shot back. "We reserve the right to refuse service and we're refusing you. Now leave before I call security." The restaurant seemed to hush around them as customers and staff alike began to notice the commotion. Servers paused mid-step, plates wobbling precariously in their hands, while diners turned in their chairs to watch the exchange. The man in the Harris shirt didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened and his gaze hardened. "I haven't done anything wrong," the man said evenly. "All I did was ask for a table." Rick sneered. "I don't care who you think you are. I'm not serving someone like you. Not in my restaurant." The hostility in his voice rang out clearly, leaving no room for misinterpretation. A few gasps rippled through the nearby tables, and a waitress standing by the coffee station muttered under her breath, "Oh no, not again." The man tilted his head, his calm facade cracking slightly as his voice lowered. "Someone like me?" he repeated. "What does that mean?" Rick's lip curled as he gestured toward the shirt. "That, Harris. You think that name means something here?" The room fell so silent that the hum of the kitchen equipment felt deafening. All eyes were on the two men now, one standing tall and indignant, the other calm but unyielding. The man's shoulders squared and his voice remained controlled, though anger simmered beneath the surface. "I'm wearing a shirt. A name. That's it. You don't know me, but you've already decided who I am, haven't you?" Rick jabbed a finger at the door. "Out. Now." The hostess, standing frozen at her station, shifted nervously. "Rick, maybe we..." Rick turned sharply toward her. "You've got tables to seat. Do your job." The hostess flinched and nodded quickly, returning her attention to her reservations, though her hands shook slightly as she flipped through the book. The man took a deep breath, his expression unreadable as he looked Rick in the eye. "You're making a mistake," he said softly. "A big one?" Rick let out a short, derisive laugh. "Oh, I don't think so. Now get out." For a moment the man didn't move. It looked like he might argue further, but then he exhaled sharply and nodded. "Fine." He turned on his heel and walked calmly toward the door, the eyes of every person in the restaurant following him. Diners whispered to each other, some shaking their heads, others staring at their plates as though embarrassed by what they just witnessed. As the man reached the door, he paused and turned back, his voice carrying across the silent room. "You might want to remember this moment," he said, his tone low but powerful. "It's going to matter soon." Rick snorted loudly. "Sure it will," he said mockingly, waving him off. "Don't come back." The man didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out of the restaurant, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that somehow sounded final. The silence in the restaurant lingered for a few moments longer before the noise slowly crept back in. The waitstaff resumed their duties, albeit more hesitantly, while the diners began murmuring amongst themselves. "Did you see that?" one customer whispered. "That was so unnecessary." "Who's Harris?" someone else asked, frowning. "Whoever he is, Rick clearly doesn't like him," a waitress muttered as she poured coffee into a mug, her hands shaking. "This isn't the first time he's thrown someone out for something stupid." At the host's stand, the young hostess glanced toward Rick, who was now barking orders at the kitchen staff as though nothing had happened. Her stomach twisted uncomfortably, and she cast a glance at the door, wishing she'd spoken up. Outside, the man in the Harris shirt stood beside his car, staring at the restaurant with a contemplative expression. The anger he'd felt inside was still there, bubbling beneath the surface, but it was tempered by something else, a sense of resolve, of clarity. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the one he was looking for. Pressing the call button, he brought the phone to his ear and waited. "Yeah," he said quietly when the call connected. It happened again. Same manager, same attitude. This time it was personal. He paused, listening to the response on the other end, then nodded slowly. "Let's move forward with the deal. I want the paperwork finalized by the end of the week." His gaze drifted back to the restaurant, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. He's not going to see this coming. Inside the restaurant, Rick continued barking orders, oblivious to the shift in energy around him. The waitstaff moved quickly, their faces pinched with frustration or embarrassment. They'd seen this kind of behavior from Rick before. His short temper, his tendency to humiliate customers he deemed unworthy, but this time felt different. A waitress whispered to another server near the coffee station, "That guy, he didn't seem like he deserved it." "I don't think this is over." The other server glanced toward Rick, who was berating a line cook for overcooking a steak. "Yeah," he muttered under his breath. "It definitely isn't." Outside the restaurant, the man in the Harris shirt sat in his car, the hum of the engine filling the silence. His hands rested on the steering wheel as he stared through the windshield, his expression unreadable. The words Rick had hurled at him echoed in his mind. "Someone like you?" The man, Marcus Harris, let out a slow, controlled breath, his knuckles tightening on the wheel. It wasn't the first time someone had treated him this way. He'd seen it before, arrogance disguised as authority, power wielded to humiliate people who didn't fit. But this time something snapped inside him. Rick's sneer, the smug way he waved Marcus off as though he were nothing, had lit a fire he couldn't ignore. Marcus glanced down at the Harris name on his shirt, running a thumb over the letters. To him it wasn't just a name. It was a legacy, one that carried more weight than most people would ever understand. A small smile touched his lips as he thought back to where it all began, his childhood and his father. Marcus had grown up in a small, modest town, raised by a single father named Harold Harris. Harold wasn't a wealthy man, but what he lacked in money, he made up for in grit and determination. He'd worked as a line cook in a local diner for most of Marcus's childhood, a job that paid little but taught him the value of hard work and humility. Marcus remembered those long days vividly. His father would wake before dawn, lacing up his scuffed work boots and tying on his stained apron with an almost reverent care. "Pride in your work, son," Harold would say, a tired smile on his face. "No matter what you do, do it with pride." Harold's dedication to his job, to his family, had left a mark on Marcus. The diner may have been small and greasy, but it had become a second home. As a boy, Marcus would sit on a stool at the counter, his chin resting on his hands as he watched his father flip pancakes and plate eggs with the kind of precision that only came from years of practice. "You're gonna run this place one day, Dad," Marcus would say with a grin. Harold would laugh, the sound warm and rich. "Maybe. But you, son, you're going to do something even better." Life, however, had other plans. When Marcus was 16, Harold collapsed behind the diner's grill during a busy breakfast rush. A heart attack had taken him in an instant. The loss was devastating for Marcus, who suddenly found himself alone in the world. At his father's funeral, the owner of the diner, a gruff businessman named Vernon Langley, had pulled Marcus aside. "Your dad was a good worker," Vernon had said, his tone brisk and emotionless. "But good workers are replaceable. You remember that?" The words had struck Marcus like a punch to the gut. Replaceable. As though his father's years of loyalty and sacrifice meant nothing. From that day forward, Marcus made himself a promise. No one would ever treat him, or anyone else, like they weren't replaceable again. Snapping back to the present, Marcus's fingers traced the edge of his phone as he scrolled through his contacts. His life had changed a lot since those days in the diner. After Harold's death, Marcus had thrown himself into his studies, fueled by a relentless drive to succeed. He'd worked his way through business school, taking odd jobs wherever he could, washing dishes, waiting tables, scrubbing floors, until he landed a job at a small consulting firm. It hadn't taken long for Marcus to climb the ranks. He had a mind for strategy and a heart for people, qualities that set him apart in a cutthroat industry. By the time he was 35, Marcus owned one of the fastest-growing business development firms in the country. He was respected, wealthy, and, most importantly, powerful enough to make sure no one like Rick Langley could ever demean him again. Because yes, Rick Langley, the smug manager who'd just thrown Marcus out, was Vernon Langley's son. Marcus had done his homework long before stepping foot in the restaurant that day. The Harris shirt he wore wasn't a random choice. It was a quiet declaration, a symbol of his father's legacy and a reminder to himself of where he came from. Marcus tapped his phone screen and dialed a number. After 2 rings, a voice answered. "Mr. Harris," the voice said crisply. "We're ready to proceed with the acquisition. All we need is your final approval." Marcus's lips curved into a faint smile. "Do it," he said. "I want the paperwork finalized immediately." "Yes, sir. The franchise will be yours within the week." Marcus ended the call and leaned back in his seat, letting the weight of what he'd just done settle over him. Rick Langley wouldn't see this coming. 4 years, Rick had run his father's restaurant franchise into the ground, mistreating employees and alienating customers with his arrogance. Marcus had quietly waited for the perfect moment to act, and today, when Rick had humiliated him in front of an entire restaurant, that moment had come. Back inside the restaurant, Rick was pacing the dining room floor, barking orders at his staff. "Keep those plates moving," he snapped at a young waiter who nearly tripped over his own feet. "If one more table complains about slow service, you're all staying late tonight." The staff exchanged uneasy glances as Rick stormed past them, his face red with frustration. The tension in the room was palpable, the atmosphere tainted by the earlier scene at the door. At the coffee station, 2 servers whispered to each other as they polished silverware. "That guy Rick threw out. Do you think he's coming back?" one asked nervously. The other shrugged. "I don't know, but he didn't seem like the kind of guy who'd just let it go." Rick overheard the comment and whirled around, his eyes narrowing. "What are you two whispering about?" "Nothing, sir," the waitress stammered, her cheeks flushing. "We were just talking about—" "Get back to work," Rick snapped, cutting her off. "I don't pay you to gossip." As the dinner rush began, the restaurant filled up once again, but the energy was different. Customers were still whispering about the man Rick had thrown out, and a few staff members were visibly distracted, their eyes darting toward the door as though expecting him to walk back in at any moment. Rick, however, seemed completely unfazed. To him, Marcus Harris was already forgotten, a nobody who dared to challenge his authority. "Table 6 is waiting on their drinks," the hostess said timidly as Rick walked by. "Then tell the bartender to move faster," Rick barked. "And quit bothering me with every little thing." He smirked to himself as he headed toward the kitchen. Some people just didn't know their place, he thought. That guy in the Harris shirt had probably thought he was important, walking in here like he owned the place. But Rick had put him in his place just like his father used to do with unruly customers back in the day. Rick didn't realize that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside, Marcus stood across the street watching the restaurant through the large front windows. The place was bustling again, but he could see the tension in the waitstaff's movements, the nervous glances they cast toward Rick whenever he passed by. "This was never about me," Marcus murmured to himself, his voice quiet. "It's about every person like my father who gave their all to this place and got nothing in return." He pulled out his phone and typed a message to his lawyer. "Make sure Rick Langley is the first to know." The response came almost immediately. "Understood, sir." Marcus smiled faintly as he tucked his phone away. It wouldn't be long now. By the end of the week, Rick's world was going to turn upside down. The next morning, Rick Langley swaggered into the restaurant at precisely 7:30 a.m., the same time he always did. He took pride in his routine, his supposed precision. The morning crew was already in full swing prepping for breakfast service. The clatter of pans and the smell of sizzling bacon greeted him, but something about the air felt different. Rick didn't notice it immediately. He was too preoccupied with barking orders as he strode into the kitchen. "Jerry, the griddle's too cold. Get it fixed or don't bother clocking in tomorrow," he snapped at a line cook. "And Anna, you're late again. One more time and you're out." The staff nodded nervously, though a few of them exchanged subtle glances when Rick turned his back. It was no secret that Rick's temper was a fuse waiting to be lit. Most of the employees had grown used to his demands over time. You learned to keep your head down and say yes, sir. It was easier than fighting back. Still, something felt off. By mid-morning, the usual flow of customers had begun trickling in. Families with young kids, elderly couples, and busy professionals grabbed quick meals on their way to work. Rick perched at his favorite spot near the host's stand, where he could keep an eye on everything: customers, staff, the cash register. He watched with an ever-critical gaze, his lips curling into a smirk whenever someone made even the smallest mistake. The hostess from the day before stood stiffly at her station, flipping through the reservation book without really seeing the pages. She was still haunted by yesterday's scene with the man in the Harris shirt. Rick caught her zoning out and snapped his fingers to get her attention. "You got tables to seat, don't just stand there dreaming. Focus, Claire." Claire flinched. "Yes, sir. Sorry." Rick shook his head and muttered under his breath, "Useless." From his spot, he didn't notice the two men who had just walked into the restaurant. They were dressed in sharp suits, their expressions unreadable as they scanned the dining room like hawks searching for prey. One of them had a clipboard tucked under his arm, and the other carried a sleek black briefcase. The hostess blinked at them in confusion. Welcome to Langley's. Table for two?" The man with the clipboard shook his head. "We're not here to eat," he said curtly. "We're here on behalf of the new ownership." Claire frowned. "New ownership? I'm sorry, I don't understand." Before the man could respond, Rick appeared, his expression darkening as he spotted the two strangers. He marched over, his chest puffed out as he planted himself in front of them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Rick said, his voice sharp with irritation. The man with the clipboard glanced at him, unimpressed. "Mr. Langley, I presume?" "Yeah, and you are?" The man ignored the question, pulling out a piece of paper and handing it to Rick. "This is a formal notice. As of this morning, ownership of this franchise has been transferred. You are to vacate the premises immediately." The blood drained from Rick's face. "What? What are you talking about?" The second man, the one with the briefcase, spoke up. "The sale has been finalized. This restaurant and every other Langley's location under this franchise is now under new ownership." Rick stared at the paper in his hand as though it might catch fire. "This is a joke," he snapped. "This isn't possible. My father owns this franchise. He's the—" "Your father sold his shares years ago," the first man interrupted flatly. "The franchise has been in financial decline ever since. The new owner has purchased it outright." Rick's face turned red, his hands shaking as he crumpled the paper. "This is ridiculous. Who bought it? I want to know right now." The man with the clipboard exchanged a glance with his colleague, then turned back to Rick with the faintest hint of a smirk. "I believe you know him already. A Mr. Marcus Harris?" The words hit Rick like a punch to the gut. His mouth opened and closed, his brain scrambling to process what he'd just heard. "H. Harris?" he stammered. "That Harris?" "Yes," the man replied coolly. "He'll be arriving shortly to inspect his new property." Rick stumbled back a step, his chest heaving. He couldn't believe it. Marcus Harris, the man he'd thrown out, humiliated in front of customers and staff, now owned the restaurant? The very thought made his blood boil. "This can't be happening," Rick muttered, shaking his head. "This can't." The faint chime of the front door cut him off. The sound seemed louder than usual, almost echoing through the restaurant as every head turned toward the entrance. Marcus Harris stepped inside, calm and collected, the same Harris shirt from yesterday still worn proudly on his back. But this time he wasn't just a man looking for a table. He was the owner of the franchise, and he carried himself as such. The restaurant fell into a stunned silence. Customers stared openly, forks hovering midair, while staff members froze in place. Even the line cooks peered out from the kitchen, their curiosity getting the better of them. Rick's face turned an ugly shade of crimson as he marched forward, pointing an accusatory finger at Marcus. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "Careful," Marcus interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "You don't want to finish that sentence?" Rick faltered, his mouth snapping shut as Marcus stepped further into the restaurant, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Mr. Langley," Marcus said, his tone measured. "It's nice to see you again. I trust you've received the paperwork?" Rick sputtered. "This isn't fair. This is my restaurant." "It was," Marcus corrected, his expression unreadable. "But not anymore. As of this morning, I own this franchise. That includes this location." Rick's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't know what you're doing. You're going to ruin this place." Marcus arched an eyebrow. Ruin it? Or fix it? He glanced around the restaurant, his eyes lingering on the nervous staff and the diners still watching with bated breath. From what I've seen, this place has been running on intimidation and fear for far too long. Rick sneered. You don't know anything about this business. Marcus smiled faintly. Actually, I know quite a bit. My father was a cook for 20 years. I learned everything about hard work and respect from him. Unlike you, I don't think employees or customers are replaceable. Rick opened his mouth to argue, but Marcus cut him off with a sharp look. I'll make this simple, he said. You're fired. Effective immediately. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Rick stumbled back as though he'd been physically struck. You can't do that. I can, Marcus replied coolly. And I just did. Rick's face twisted in fury, but before he could say another word, the men in suits stepped forward. We'll escort you out, Mr. Langley, one of them said firmly. Rick turned toward the staff, his eyes wild. Are you just going to let this happen? He shouted. I built this place. No one responded. The servers, the cooks, even the hostess, all of them remained silent, their gazes fixed on Marcus. Rick's chest heaved as he realized he had no support, no allies left. You'll regret this, Rick spat at Marcus, his voice trembling with rage. Marcus didn't flinch. I doubt it. Rick stormed out of the restaurant, the door slamming behind him with a finality that seemed to reverberate through the room. For a moment there was silence. Then slowly the staff began to relax. The cooks returned to their stations, the waiters resumed their duties, and the tension that had gripped the restaurant for so long began to lift. Marcus turned toward the employees, his voice calm but kind. Things are going to be different around here, he said. Starting today. The hostess, Claire, looked up at him, her eyes wide. You're really the owner now? She asked hesitantly. Marcus nodded. I am. Claire smiled for the first time in days. Thank God. The next morning, the sun streamed through the restaurant windows, illuminating the once tired dining room that now gleamed with renewed life. The place was spotless, tables wiped to perfection, chairs aligned neatly, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. A small bouquet of flowers sat at the hostess stand, a detail that hadn't been there before. Marcus Harris stood near the kitchen pass-through, a faint smile on his face as he watched the team work. It had only been a day since he'd taken over, but the energy inside the restaurant felt entirely new. Staff moved with purpose, their footsteps lighter. Servers laughed quietly as they restocked their stations. Cooks hummed while chopping vegetables, and the tension that had hung over the place like a storm cloud under Rick's rule was gone. It was exactly what Marcus had envisioned. The customers noticed it too. By mid-morning, regulars began trickling in, surprised at how different everything felt. An elderly woman who had stopped visiting months ago, tired of Rick's scowls and poor service, peered around cautiously before stepping inside. Claire, now standing tall at her hostess station, greeted her with a warm smile. Welcome back, Mrs. Reynolds, Claire said brightly. It's good to see you. The woman smiled faintly, clutching her purse. Is that awful man still here? She asked, her voice hushed. Claire shook her head. No, ma'am. He's gone for good. The woman let out a sigh of relief and stepped fully into the dining room. Well, it's about time, she muttered before allowing Claire to lead her to a table. At the other end of the restaurant, Marcus moved among the tables, checking in on customers with ease. He stopped at one booth where a young father sat with his two children. How's everything today? Marcus asked, his voice friendly but sincere. The man looked up, startled for a moment. It's great actually, he said. This place feels different. Like it's alive again. Marcus smiled. That's the idea. The little girl sitting across from her father stared at Marcus's Harris shirt, curiosity shining in her eyes. Why does it say Harris on your back? She asked. Marcus knelt down slightly so he was at her level. Because it's my name, he said gently. And because I want to remember where I came from. The girl tilted her head. Where did you come from? Marcus's smile softened. A place where people believed hard work matters, he said. And where no one should ever feel small. The father gave Marcus an appreciative nod. We'll definitely be back, he said. Back in the kitchen, the cooks worked more efficiently than they had in months. Jerry flipped pancakes like a pro, humming to himself as he worked. Beside him, Anna prepared omelets, her hands moving quickly as she smiled for the first time anyone could remember. This is how it's supposed to be, Jerry muttered to Anna as they worked side by side. Anna nodded. Yeah, she said softly. It feels good. The back door swung open and Marcus entered, carrying a tray of fresh produce he'd picked up from a local supplier. You guys need anything else back here? He asked. Jerry turned, blinking in surprise. You're picking up deliveries too? Marcus shrugged with a grin. Why not? I'm part of the team, remember? Anna laughed quietly, shaking her head. I still can't believe you're the owner, she said. I mean, most people like you wouldn't even step foot in the kitchen. Marcus's smile faded slightly. People like me? Anna's cheeks flushed. I didn't mean. Marcus raised a hand gently to stop her. It's okay. I get what you mean, he said. But that's exactly why I'm here. I want to prove that it doesn't matter how much money you have, or what title's on your business card. Work is work. Everyone deserves respect. Jerry grinned. Well, I'll tell you one thing, he said. I've worked here for 5 years, and this is the first time I don't feel like quitting. Marcus chuckled. Good to hear, Jerry. Now, let's make sure we keep it that way. Word about the changes spread quickly. By lunchtime, the restaurant was packed. Customers who had avoided the place under Rick's management began returning, curious to see what all the buzz was about. Social media posts popped up with captions like, "The new owner turned this place around overnight," and "It's like walking into a completely different restaurant." Behind the scenes, Marcus worked tirelessly to keep things running smoothly. He coordinated orders, helped seat customers, and even ran food when the servers were overwhelmed. At one point, Claire stopped him near the host's stand, her eyes wide. "We've already hit our best lunch sales in months," she said, holding up a printout of the day's numbers. "This is crazy." Marcus smiled. "It's just the beginning." Claire hesitated, biting her lip before speaking again. "Mr. Harris?" "Call me Marcus," he said. "Marcus," she corrected. "I just wanted to say, thank you. For giving us a chance. For treating us like we matter." Marcus's smile grew warmer. "You don't need to thank me, Claire. You've always mattered. Rick just didn't see it." Claire nodded, tears welling in her eyes as she turned back to her station. That afternoon, Marcus sat in the corner booth with a small stack of papers in front of him. The purchase of the franchise had finalized fully, and now he was reviewing each location one by one. As he flipped through the pages, a shadow fell across the table. "Mind if I sit?" Marcus looked up to find Rick Langley standing there, his face red and his expression sour. He wore a wrinkled button-up shirt, and his usual air of arrogance was gone, replaced by something closer to desperation. Marcus leaned back slowly, his gaze cool. "I don't remember inviting you." Rick ignored the jab and dropped into the seat across from him. "What do you want, Harris?" he said, his voice low. "You've got the franchise, you've humiliated me. What's next? Are you going to rub it in?" Marcus regarded him for a long moment before shaking his head. "No," he said simply. "That's not why I'm here." Rick snorted. "Then what are you doing? Turning my father's business into some charity project?" Marcus's eyes darkened. "Your father's business was built on people like my dad. People who showed up every day, worked hard, and got nothing in return. Your father didn't see their value. And neither did you." Rick flinched slightly, but Marcus continued. "I bought this franchise to honor my father's legacy, not to tear you down, Rick. But let's be clear. You brought this on yourself?" Rick looked away, his jaw tight. "You think you're better than me?" he muttered. "No," Marcus replied quietly. "I think I was lucky enough to learn something you never did. Respect costs nothing, but it changes everything." Rick said nothing. For the first time he looked small, deflated. Marcus slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "This is for you?" Rick frowned, glancing down at the paper. "What is it?" "A list of local businesses hiring managers," Marcus said. "You've got experience. Maybe this time you'll treat people better." Rick's face turned red again, but he said nothing as he stood up. He snatched the paper, stuffed it into his pocket, and turned to leave. Before he walked away, Marcus added quietly, "Everyone deserves a second chance, Rick. Even you." Rick hesitated briefly, but he didn't look back. The restaurant continued to thrive in the weeks that followed. Marcus implemented changes that transformed the franchise into something extraordinary. Employees were paid better wages, given more manageable schedules, and treated like human beings. Customers returned in droves, drawn not just by the food but by the atmosphere, the sense that this was a place where everyone mattered. Claire was promoted to manager, a role she embraced with pride. Jerry and Anna became team leads in the kitchen, mentoring new staff members with the same respect Marcus had shown them. The restaurant became a community hub, a place where families gathered, where employees smiled, and where Marcus's father's legacy lived on. One evening, as the sun set behind the restaurant, Marcus stood outside with his hands in his pockets, watching customers file in through the front doors. Pride in your work, Dad? He murmured softly to himself. No matter what you do. In the window's reflection, he could see the name printed on the back of his shirt, Harris. It was no longer just a name, it was a symbol of hope, of second chances, of what was possible when you led with respect and humility. Mr. Harris? Claire called from the door. We're ready for you inside. Marcus turned, smiling as he walked toward the restaurant, the sounds of laughter and clinking plates spilling out behind him. This time he didn't need to remember where he came from. He was already there.